The woods whispered again. Elsie Wilkins stirred in her sleep, her brow damp with sweat, the echo of a child's voice trailing through her dreams. It was always a child's voice, always calling from the trees, and always in March. She woke with a start, heart pounding in her ears. The window beside her bed was open, though she had closed it before dark. Cold night air swept through, carrying the scent of moss and damp earth. The sound of creaking branches lingered like a secret spoken too close. She turned toward the window slowly. Beyond the glass, a pale mist hugged the ground, curling between gravestones. The family cottage, modest and grey, stood just inside the border of Gallow's Hollow's ancient cemetery. Her father, the gravekeeper, kept their world tidy with a shovel and silence, but no one could bury what lived in those woods. Elsie's bare feet touched the floor. She padded to the window and peered out. There, near the twisted yew tree at the edge of the hollow, something moved, not fast, not sudden, just enough to freeze her breath. She squinted, the moonlight catching on something small and pale lying in the grass. A doll. Her throat tightened. It had been 4 years since the last child disappeared. Everyone in Gallow's Hollow remembered, but no one ever spoke of it. They avoided the date the way one avoids an open grave, pretending it wasn't there, pretending the screams hadn't echoed, pretending the blood hadn't stained the earth. Now it was March again, and it was a leap year. If you're drawn to forgotten stories, the kind that haunt places no one dares to name, go ahead and subscribe. This tale is just beginning. Elsie shut the window with trembling fingers. Outside, the fog thickened. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled once, a sound so deep and mournful it seemed to settle into her bones. Midnight. The town would be awake soon. March always brought early risers and hushed prayers. By dawn, the baker's windows would be fogged from nervous breath. The preacher would be shouting warnings about wrath, and her father would pretend he hadn't wept the night before. Elsie dressed quickly. She tied her boots tight and pulled on her brother's old coat. It still smelled faintly of cedar and dust, though he hadn't worn it since 1851. That year, the snow melted early. That year, the hollow had taken him. Everyone called it a disappearance, said maybe he'd wandered off, maybe a bear had taken him, maybe the river had frozen wrong, and he'd fallen through. So many maybes, so many lies whispered with eyes downcast and hands clutching prayer beads. But Elsie had seen the prints, bare feet, her brother's size, leading toward the hollow, and then stopping as if swallowed. No dragging marks, no blood, just an absence. Now in 1855 she was 11, the same age he had been when he vanished. And last night, for the first time in 4 years, she'd heard the voice again, whispering from the woods, whispering her name. She stepped outside, the cold biting at her cheeks. The doll still lay near the yew tree, small and wooden, its carved face tilted toward the cemetery. Elsie approached slowly, every instinct screaming to stop. She bent down. The doll was smooth, freshly carved, with eyes painted a shade too close to her own. A chill crawled up her spine. She turned it over. On the back, a single word was etched. Elsie. Her breath caught. A branch snapped in the woods behind her. She didn't run. She stood perfectly still, holding the doll close to her chest, the fog wrapping around her legs like fingers. In the silence, the hollow seemed to lean in, listening, and from somewhere deep within, a voice like wind through bone whispered again, "March has come." Elsie tucked the doll beneath her coat and stepped back from the yew tree. The fog clung to her ankles as she returned to the cottage, every step echoing against the gravestones like distant knocks on a coffin lid. Inside, her father was already awake, sitting at the edge of the hearth with his hands wrapped around a tin mug. His face, weathered by years of digging and silence, twitched when he saw her. He didn't ask where she'd been. "Cold morning," he muttered. She nodded and dropped the doll onto the table between them. His eyes fixed on it, then quickly shifted away, as if the thing burned his vision. "Where did you find that?" "By the yew," she said. "It had my name carved in the back." He rubbed his temples, his knuckles raw from years of labor. "You shouldn't go near that tree, Elsie. You said the same thing to Thomas." The name lingered like smoke. He didn't respond. Instead, he rose slowly, picked up the doll with trembling fingers, and threw it into the hearth. The flames took it instantly, but not before Elsie noticed something. The painted eyes on the doll melted last, staring at her until the end. Outside, bells rang from the chapel tower, 3 slow tolls. It was the first Sunday of March. In Gallow's Hollow, no one missed morning prayer in March. They walked in silence past shuttered windows and low whispers. The town square was lined with crooked houses and even more crooked backs. No one looked at one another. Children were clutched tightly by their mothers. The preacher stood tall on the chapel steps, a man with eyes like coals and a voice that broke mountains. "Wrath comes for the disobedient," he roared, "and the earth remembers our debts." Elsie stared at him, unmoved. She used to believe every word he said, back when she thought God lived in those woods and that maybe her brother had gone home to him. Now she wasn't so sure. After service, the villagers gathered for bread and silence in the square. An old man whispered to his wife, "It's always in March." A girl clung to her doll and wept when a gust of wind carried it away. No one chased it. Not into the trees. Elsie wandered from the square, drawn to the edge of the cemetery. The graves there were old, older than the town itself, some said. The oldest one bore no name, just the date 1724, and the carving of a single eye. Her father once told her those who died unnamed were remembered differently. She didn't understand it then. She wasn't sure she wanted to now. Later back home, her mother stirred in her bed, thin, pale, and always whispering. Fever dreams took her every winter, but March made it worse. Her words twisted together like thread unraveling. "It comes for the little ones," she murmured. "1 every 4. Just one, just one." Elsie touched her forehead, burning. She reached for the cloth and water, but paused when her mother grabbed her wrist. "Not you," she said, eyes suddenly sharp and wet. "Not again." Elsie pulled away gently. Her mother fell back into the pillow, already lost to sleep. The fear in her voice remained behind like a shadow. In the attic, Elsie found a box her brother once kept, drawings, feathers, scraps of bark and twine, a small knife with his initials carved into the handle, and under the lining a folded sheet of paper. She opened it. A drawing, crude and shaky but unmistakable. A tree with twisted roots. The yew tree. At its base, a door, half buried, round and open. Beneath it, scribbled in graphite, "Don't go alone." Elsie stared at the page, heart knocking against her ribs. She remembered the voice from the woods, the whisper, the doll with her name. And now this. The hollow had started calling again, and this time it wanted her. The chapel loomed larger at night. Elsie waited until the village lights dimmed and the streets emptied. The moon carved silver lines through the mist as she crossed the square, keeping to the shadows. Her breath puffed in short clouds, nerves clenching with each step. She'd never disobeyed a church curfew before, not even as a dare. But the yew tree, the doll, the drawing, and now the cellar. She slipped around the back of the chapel, where old vines tangled around the foundation. There, behind a broken gate, was a cellar door, warped from age and swollen with damp. Her brother had once told her it led to tunnels the preachers used during harsh winters, where they stored food, books, and things no one else was meant to see. Elsie pushed the door open. It groaned in protest, louder than she wanted. She hesitated, listening. No footsteps, no shouts, only wind. She stepped inside. The air was cold and thick with the smell of wax and stone. Shadows danced along the walls, cast by her flickering lantern. Old shelves lined the corridor, books stacked in crooked piles, rusted tools, jars of pickled herbs. She passed them all, drawn by something deeper. Then she saw it. At the end of the passage, behind a curtain of cobwebs, was a heavy wooden chest with a lock as thick as her wrist. It was half open, its hinges broken as if someone had forced it in haste. Inside lay a leather-bound ledger. She opened it, her fingers trembling. The first pages were filled with neat, formal script, records of baptisms, weddings, deaths, ordinary things. Then the ink changed. The lines became shorter, Sharper. Dates. Years. Each 4th year. Each March. And beside each, a name. Abigail Merton. Jonah Clark. Ruth Holloway. One child. Always in March. Every leap year. Elsie turned the pages faster, her chest tightening. Matthew Crane. Lydia Penn. Thomas Wilkins. Her brother's name burned against the page like a wound. The final entry was dated only a week ago. Just a single line written in fresh ink, yet no name beside it. Just space. Waiting. Elsie staggered back. The ledger clutched to her chest. A noise echoed above, a creak, then a thud. She froze. Someone was in the chapel. She extinguished the lantern and pressed herself against the wall, listening as footsteps crossed the floorboards above, heavy, slow, deliberate. They paused directly over her. The silence stretched. Then came the faintest whisper, not from above, but from the chest. "Elsie." Her skin prickled. She backed away, heart hammering, unable to breathe. She turned and ran, feet barely touching the stone floor, out into the night. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the cemetery, the ledger still clutched tight. At home, her father was waiting. He didn't speak when she entered. Just stared at her, eyes shadowed and cold. His gaze dropped to the ledger. For a moment she saw something flicker there, fear, maybe, or grief, or something heavier. "You've gone too far," he said quietly. "You knew," she replied. "You knew all along." He looked away. "Go to bed." But she didn't move. She held up the book, opened to 1851. "You let him go." His jaw tightened. "It wasn't my choice." "Then whose was it?" He didn't answer, only walked to the hearth and sat beside the embers, staring into them like they held forgiveness. Upstairs, her mother was coughing in her sleep, whispering her name again and again. Elsie stood in the doorway, watching her twist beneath the sheets. "Not you, not again." She tucked the ledger beneath her mattress and lay awake the rest of the night, eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting the seconds until dawn. Outside, the fog thickened. The hollow waited. The widow Mathers lived at the edge of Gallow's Hollow, past the weeping willows and down a crooked path no one else dared walk. Children whispered that she had no eyes, only sockets filled with ash. Others said she talked to the dead, but Elsie knew better. Widow Mathers saw more than anyone in town, even if her eyes were clouded with age. Elsie knocked once on the weathered door and let herself in. The air inside was thick with herbs and dust. Every inch of the cottage was cluttered, jars of dried roots, bones tied with red string, faded drawings pinned to the walls like warnings. "How you smell like graves," the widow rasped from her chair. Elsie didn't flinch. "You knew my brother." "I've known every child taken." The girl stepped forward, the ledger tight under her arm. "Why do they disappear?" Widow Mathers leaned forward, her milky eyes glinting. "You think they disappear? That's what the others want you to believe." "That they vanish, poof like dew in sunlight." She shook her head slowly. "They're given." Elsie's mouth dried. "To what?" The widow's voice dropped, barely above a whisper. "To the hollow." A silence stretched between them, heavy as soil on a coffin. "It started long before your time," she continued. "This town nearly died. Crops failed. Disease came like wolves. Children dropped in the streets. Then the elders made a bargain. One child every 4th year given in March, and the land would thrive." Elsie's hands trembled. "That's monstrous." "It was survival. What is one child for the life of many?" Elsie's voice sharpened. "He was my brother." Widow Mathers tilted her head. "And now the hollow wants you." Elsie stepped back. "You hear the voice, don't you?" the widow asked. "You felt it in your bones. The wind calling your name, the dreams, the cold that follows." Elsie said nothing. The widow reached into her apron and pulled out a small charm, a circle of twine and thorns bound by a silver thread. She pressed it into Elsie's hand. "It won't stop the hollow," she said, "but it might slow its hunger." The girl looked down at the charm. "Why help me?" "Because I once had a daughter," the widow whispered. "Her name was Clara. She was 8. She had a laugh like birds in spring. Elsie blinked. She was taken in 1807. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the distant creaking of the woods outside. Why do the townspeople still obey? Elsie asked. Why pretend? Because the hollow keeps its promise. No child taken, no sickness, no offering, and the ground rots. People remember the years they disobeyed. They remember the plague, the screams, the fire. Elsie stood. Her legs were stiff, but her mind burned. I won't let it happen again. Widow Mathers smiled faintly. Then you'll die. Maybe, Elsie said, but not without a fight. The widow nodded slowly. Then you need to learn what the hollow truly is. It's not a hole in the ground, child. It's older than the dirt, older than the sky above. And it listens, always listens. Elsie turned to leave. Stay away from the roots, the widow warned. The oldest trees hide the deepest mouths. As she stepped outside, the air was sharper, the sun pale and thin behind a veil of grey. The town below looked smaller now, more fragile. She tightened her grip on the charm and tucked it under her shirt. The hollow was watching. But now, she was watching back. By the following morning, word had spread. The doll-maker's shop sat quiet and shuttered, its windows covered in soot, its chimney cold. No light, no fire, no sign of Mr. Hemley. The villagers muttered in half-sentences, their glances heavy with worry. In Gallow's hollow, silence often spoke louder than any bell. Elsie stood across the road, staring at the crooked sign above the door, Hemley's Toys and Repair. He had lived alone since his wife died years ago. Quiet, kind, gentle, never missed church, never raised his voice. And now he was simply gone. She waited until the sun dipped behind the pines. When the last shopkeeper locked up and the final patrol passed by, she crossed the street and slipped through the alley behind the shop. The back door gave way with a soft creak. Inside, the air was thick with dust and wood shavings. The scent of varnish still lingered, though the hearth had gone cold. Rows of shelves lined the walls, each filled with carved animals, spinning tops and hand-painted puppets. Everything perfectly arranged, untouched. But something felt wrong, too still, too expectant. She moved deeper into the room, her boots crunching over scattered sawdust. The door to the back workroom was ajar. Inside, the world changed. Dozens of dolls lined the walls, standing upright on small pedestals. Each one was carved with eerie precision. Small bodies, stiff limbs, frozen expressions. Some smiled faintly, others looked as if they were on the verge of crying. But it wasn't the craftsmanship that stopped her breath, it was the names. Each doll bore a tiny tag stitched to its chest, names she recognized. Ruth Holloway, Jonah Clark, Matthew Crane, the children from the ledger. Her fingers trembled as she moved past them. In the corner sat a larger shelf, and on it, one final doll, a boy with sandy hair, wearing a coat that looked oddly familiar. Thomas. Her breath caught. His face, his real face, carved in miniature, perfect in every detail. But its mouth was stitched shut with black thread. She reached for it. The floor groaned. Elsie froze, listening. But there was no one, only the dolls. She cradled the carved figure in her hands. Its body was warm, like something that had just been held. She didn't understand how or why, but she knew one thing. Mr. Hemley hadn't made these to sell. He'd made them to remember, or worse, to trap. On the workbench beside her, she found the doll-maker's ledger. Not like the church's, no names and dates, but sketches. Dozens of childlike forms, each labeled with symbols she didn't recognize, circles within circles, strange branching runes, and beneath one of them, written in neat ink, to hold what the hollow can't digest. Elsie stepped back. Her skin crawled. What had the hollow become that even it couldn't consume everything? She turned to leave, but something caught her eye. A carving knife sat on the table, clean and sharp. The handle was carved with initials, T.W., her brother's. Her legs gave out. She sat hard on the floor, clutching the doll to her chest, her heart hammering. He'd been here. She didn't know how, she didn't know why. But somehow, in some form, Thomas had passed through this room. A draught of cold air swept through the space, stirring the dolls. Their heads shifted ever so slightly, their glass eyes reflecting the flicker of a dying lantern flame. Elsie rose and fled, the doll pressed tight against her. Outside, the wind howled like a thing enraged. She didn't stop running until her home was in sight. When she reached her bed, she tucked the doll beneath her blanket. It didn't move, it didn't whisper, but it watched. And in the quiet of the night, a thought surfaced she couldn't shake. The hollow didn't just take, it remembered. Elsie didn't sleep. She watched the carved face of the Thomas doll until morning light crept through the curtains. Its stitched mouth remained still, its wooden eyes glassy. Yet it felt alive, like something waiting for the right silence to speak. As the sun rose, she slipped out of bed. The ledger from the church cellar clutched tight. She needed answers, more than whispers and warnings, real ones, from real mouths. She headed to the town's archives, tucked beneath the schoolhouse and rarely visited. No one liked to linger where records gathered dust. Knowledge in Gallow's Hollow was often dangerous. The clerk, Mr. Ellery, barely looked up from his tea-stained desk when she entered. "Researching your lineage," he muttered. "No," Elsie said. "The others." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. She moved through the narrow aisles of brittle paper and ink-smudged books until she found the civic record: births, deaths, disappearances. Her fingers skimmed through years of decay until she found what she needed: the names. All the children listed in the church's ledger appeared again and again in these reports, always with brief, incomplete explanations. Vanished near the woods. Last seen walking alone. Missing since March 3rd. No real investigations, no conclusions, just resignation written in cursive. But something else caught her eye. One of the names wasn't in the civic log at all. Ruth Holloway. There was a baptism record. No death, no disappearance, no burial, as if she'd never existed. Elsie frowned. She flipped through more entries and found similar gaps. Whole names erased from town memory. Officially, they had no last known address, no relatives. As if someone had carved them out of history, like rot from fruit. She clutched the church ledger tighter. Someone was hiding more than just the bargain. That afternoon, she returned to the cemetery. Her father was digging near the southern slope, where the oldest stones slouched under moss and ivy. "You've been busy," he said without looking up. "I need to know who keeps the ledger." He paused mid-shovel. "That's not for you. It's already mine." He looked at her then, his face drawn, older than before. "You think this started with a book, that someone just writes a name and the hollow listens? I think someone chooses." Silence stretched between them. "You're too young to understand." "I'm the same age Thomas was." He flinched. Elsie stepped closer. "You knew he'd be taken." He leaned on the shovel. "No one chooses." She held up the ledger. "Then who writes the names?" His voice cracked. "The church, the elders. I don't know anymore." "But someone decides," she insisted. "Someone opens the door." Her father turned away. "The hollow doesn't need help. It knows." "It always knows." "Then why a list?" His hands gripped the handle tighter. "So we can prepare." Her heart pounded. "So we can watch?" He said nothing. Elsie left him there in the dirt, guilt and fear clinging to his shadow. She walked until the village faded behind her, the trees thickening, the fog curling low. At the base of the U, she opened the ledger again. The last entry stared up at her, the most recent leap year, no name, not yet. She pulled a pencil from her coat, stared at the blank line. Her fingers hovered. A sound behind her made her turn. A woman stood at the edge of the trees, her hair long and tangled, her eyes hollow and sunken, and familiar. Elsie's breath caught. It was Mrs. Hemley, but she'd been dead for years. The woman's mouth didn't move, but a whisper reached Elsie's ears all the same. "Don't write it down." Elsie blinked, and the woman was gone. She closed the ledger, her hands trembling. She didn't know what haunted the hollow, what fed it, what ruled it. But she knew one thing now. Someone wasn't letting it act alone. and it was almost time. The forest opened like a throat. Twilight bled into the sky as Elsie slipped past the last row of gravestones, the yew tree behind her, the ledger left buried beneath a pile of rocks. She carried only the charm Widow Mathers had given her, and the knife with her brother's initials. Both felt heavier than they should. The trees thickened quickly, twisting inward, bending like watchers over a gate. Each step muffled the world behind her. No birdsong, no breeze, no sound but her own heartbeat. She followed the path from her brother's old drawing, down the slope, past the rock shaped like a kneeling man, along a dry stream bed where moss grew in arrow patterns, and finally the hollow. It wasn't a clearing, it wasn't a cave, it was a wound. The trees gave way to a wide depression in the earth, its center dark and bare, surrounded by roots coiled like ribs. Mist hung in its center, swirling without wind. Elsie stood at its edge, breath caught, eyes burning. Then, a whisper. Her name. Elsie. She didn't move. The fog thickened, curling into forms, shapes like children. Small hands reaching, flickers of faces. One passed close. For a moment it looked like Ruth Holloway. The same ribbon, the same sad eyes. Then gone. Another form took shape. A boy, hands in pockets, staring at the ground. Thomas. Her knees went weak. Thomas? He didn't answer. She stepped forward. The ground shifted beneath her feet, not breaking, not crumbling, but breathing. The hollow inhaled, its rhythm low and slow like something ancient stirring in its sleep. Thomas looked up. His eyes were wrong, not cruel, not empty, but unreadable, like glass over something broken. "I'm still here," he said. "I never left." Elsie reached for him, but her hand passed through. "No," he said quietly. "Not like that. What is this place?" His voice was faint, fading. "It's not a place, it's a mouth," she blinked. "A mouth. It eats what no one wants, what they give away." Elsie's heart pounded. "Did they give you away?" Thomas nodded once. "And others before me. Why can't you leave?" "I'm part of the breath now," he said. The air, the whisper. The fog thickened again, forming more figures. Some wept, some laughed softly. None of them stepped beyond the roots. "Why show me this?" she whispered. "Because you're the last." She shook her head. "I'm not. I won't be." "You already are." Elsie turned in a slow circle, scanning the hollow's edge. No visible doors, no stairs, no end. "Is there a way to break it?" Thomas didn't speak. "Thomas, please." He reached into his coat and pulled out a scrap of parchment, folded twice. He let it drift toward her on the mist. She caught it, written in her brother's cramped hand. It must take what it was promised, or be fed something else. She looked up. What does that mean? But he was gone. The hollow exhaled. The fog pulled back. At its center, a small round door shimmered into view, just like in the drawing. Half buried, covered in roots, slowly opening. Inside, darkness. Something waited there, a shape not yet formed, a hunger not yet sated. Elsie stepped back, the charm burning cold against her skin. She had seen enough. She turned and fled the way she came, heart slamming against her ribs, trees leaning in, whispering as she passed. When she reached the yew, the fog stopped. Behind her, the hollow pulsed once, like a final breath drawn in, and then silence. The roots no longer hid what lay beneath. The hollow stayed quiet for 3 days. Elsie didn't return to the edge, but the fog crept closer each night, curling beneath windows, seeping into dreams. Her mother no longer spoke, her father no longer met her eyes, and the charm from Widow Mathers grew heavier around her neck, like it had absorbed something dark. On the 4th morning, Elsie woke with a word etched across her window in breath. Soon. She didn't scream. Instead, she packed her brother's knife, the parchment he gave her, and a vial of lamp oil. Then she made her way back into the woods, not toward the hollow this time, but to the place the widow once whispered about. Follow the ash trees. When the ground smells like copper, dig. She found the trees before dusk, a grove of blackened trunks, their bark cracked and oozing. The earth beneath was dry but stained red. A circle of stones half swallowed by moss marked the spot. She knelt, pulled back layers of dead leaves, and began to dig. The soil came up strange, darker, softer, laced with white flecks that weren't stones. Bone. A few inches down, her fingers struck wood. A small box. Inside, wrapped in cloth stained with age, she found old charms strung with bone beads, dried sprigs of bloodroot, and a book bound in stitched leather. She didn't recognize the symbols on the cover, spirals, roots, and a shape like an eye inside a mouth. She opened it. The ink was brown, faded, and smelled faintly of rust. A diary, she realized, written by someone who called themselves Keeper of the Bargain. The entries were dated in the early 1700s. Elsie read, March 5th, 1724. The fever took 9 more. We buried them in haste. The soil rejected them. Father Merrin spoke with the forest. He said the hollow answered, March 8th, 1724. It wants what we cannot name, a life, a soul not yet bound. In return, the sickness ends. We must choose one. I wept as I wrote her name, March 30th, 1724. It kept its word. The crops grew green again. The dead stayed buried. The child was never found. The town calls it mercy. I call it debt. Elsie's hands shook as she turned the last page. A message had been scrawled across the inside cover, not in the original hand, but one she recognized. The debt grows teeth when fed too long. It doesn't sleep anymore. She closed the book, breath catching. This wasn't a curse. It was an agreement. A conscious, repeated, calculated choice, generation after generation. Made not in ignorance, but in complicity. Her town had never been innocent. She gathered the contents of the box, wrapped them tight and slipped the bone charm into her pocket. But as she turned to leave, something rustled behind her. A figure stepped from the trees. Not mist, not memory. A man. Old. Bent. Wearing the faded robes of a preacher long dead. His skin was paper-thin, and his eyes glowed like cinders. You shouldn't have come here, he said. Elsie backed away. You read the book, he continued. Then you know what you must do. I won't. His voice turned sharp. Then your town will burn. She drew the knife. Let it. His laugh was like dry leaves in wind. Brave child. Foolish. The hollow doesn't need you to believe. It only needs the promise kept. Elsie's voice didn't shake. Then break it. It cannot be broken. Everything breaks. She ran, his voice following her through the trees. One must still be given. When she reached the edge of the forest, the fog was already waiting. But now she had something the hollow feared. A name it couldn't swallow, and a truth she would no longer bury. The house was dark when Elsie returned. The front door creaked as she entered, but no one called her name. No light flickered in the hearth. No footsteps stirred above. Only silence, and the smell of burnt ash. She found her father in the parlor, sitting rigidly in his chair, hands clasped like a man waiting for a verdict. On the floor beside him lay the church's ledger, open to the final blank entry. I know, Elsie said. His eyes didn't move. I read the journal, the first offering, the promise. Still, nothing. She stepped closer. You knew all of it, not just the curse, the pattern, the selection. At last, he lifted his gaze. His voice was hoarse. We don't select. You did. He didn't argue. Her fingers tightened around the book. It was you. You wrote Thomas's name. I didn't want to, he said. That doesn't matter. He looked toward the window where fog licked the glass. He was chosen. I begged them to choose another, but the hollow had already spoken, and when the fog came, they said the name had to be written, that it sealed the pact. You sealed it, she said, with your hand. His shoulders sagged beneath the weight of guilt. They told me he wouldn't feel pain, that he'd vanish. That the hollow only takes, not tortures. But he's still there. I know. Elsie's throat burned, and now it wants me. He looked at her then, truly looked. Not if I stop it. She stepped back. What are you saying? He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter, already stained at the corners. A name must be written before March ends, and if it's not yours, he held it out. Elsie didn't take it. You'd offer yourself? I should have gone instead of him. I know that. Tears welled in her eyes. You can't undo it by dying. But maybe I can end it. She shook her head. The hollow doesn't bargain. It takes. His hand lowered. Then let it take me. She looked down at the charm around her neck, then back at him. There's another way. He laughed bitterly. The only way this ends is when someone else begins it again. No, she said. Not this time. His face turned cold. You've seen what lives in that forest. I have. And you think it can be reasoned with? I think it can be exposed, he scoffed. To who? The town won't believe you. They never believe. They need the lie. Then I'll tear it down myself. He stood, the ledger clutched in his arms now like a shield. If you run, it'll follow. If you hide, it'll find you. I'm not running, she said. I'm walking into it. His face twisted. Then you're giving it exactly what it wants. No, Elsie said quietly. I'm going to make it choke. Her father didn't stop her as she walked past. He didn't speak. He simply stared at the fireless hearth, the weight of every lost child pressing on his shoulders. Upstairs, her mother whispered from her bed, words broken by fever. The roots. The roots. Dig too deep. Elsie touched her hand. I'm going to end it, Mama. Outside, the sky had turned copper, the last day of March breathing through the trees. She packed only what she needed, the bloodroot charm, her brother's knife, the journal, the parchment, and then, before she closed the door, she turned back to her father. If I don't come back, don't let them bury me. He nodded slowly. You're stronger than we ever were. She stepped into the fog, boots firm on the earth, the silence of the hollow waiting like an open mouth. It had taken from her. Now she was coming to take something back. The villagers gathered at dusk. Fog clung low over the chapel steps, coiling around boots and skirts as a slow bell tolled from the tower. No one spoke as they assembled, not truly, only hushed breaths, glances over shoulders, fingers gripping rosaries or folded hands. March 29th. The final night. At the center stood Reverend Caldwell, robed in ash grey, his voice soft as he read from a worn parchment that shook ever so slightly in the wind. One life given, that many may thrive. Elsie stood at the edge of the crowd, wrapped in her brother's coat, her hair braided tight. Her boots were soaked with mist, her hands cold, her chest iron. She watched as names were whispered, not aloud, but into cupped palms and clenched fists. It was theatre, solemn, sacred and hollow. No one noticed her at first, not until she stepped into the center. Gasps rippled. The Reverend's voice faltered. She didn't wait for permission. This isn't a ritual, it's a sentence. All eyes turned to her, wide, pale, uncertain. We've been feeding a thing in the dark for over a century. Children, our children. The Reverend raised a hand. You've no right. She held up the journal. I have every right. This book, written by the first who made the pact, proves what this town has done, what you've continued. Murmurs spread through the crowd like sparks. Elsie lifted the ledger next. And this is the tool of your obedience, the names you chose, the names you signed. One man stepped forward. You don't understand. No, you don't understand, Elsie snapped. This thing in the hollow doesn't care about tradition. It cares about submission. You've made it strong by bending your knees. Elsie, the Reverend tried again. She turned to him. You knew Thomas. You baptized him. And 4 years later, you let him walk into the woods. He didn't deny it. A silence followed. Then another voice rose from the crowd. She's right, said a woman near the back. My sister vanished in 47, and no one even searched. They told us she drowned, muttered another, but they buried nothing. The Reverend raised his voice. Enough. This town stands because of the bargain. The land grows, the water runs clean, the plague never returned. Elsie stepped forward. At what cost? He met her eyes. You want to undo it all? Bring ruin down upon every soul here? She didn't blink. No. I want to bring the truth. A gust of wind swept through the crowd. The fog thickened. From the forest's edge the yew tree groaned. The Reverend's voice cracked. Then go, child. Speak with your hollow. Let it judge you. He meant it as mockery, a challenge. Elsie took it as a door. She turned from the crowd and walked toward the trees. No one followed. Behind her the chapel bell tolled again. 9 chimes, 9 children, 9 offerings since her brother. This time there would not be 10. As she crossed the final field, the air grew still. The fog parted before her like a curtain. Roots shifted beneath the soil and shadows curled like ribbons through the trees. The hollow was waiting. She reached the edge, the great depression in the earth, where mist spun above the open door, still half covered in roots. The air buzzed with breathless hunger. She stepped forward. I'm not here to run, she said aloud. The mist stirred. I'm here to finish this. From the dark came a sound, not voice, not echo, a murmur of recognition. Then, silence. Elsie reached into her coat, pulled free the charm of bone and thread. She held it over the hollow's mouth and dropped it in. The charm vanished into the dark like a spark swallowed by smoke. For a moment nothing moved, no wind, no fog. Even the trees held their breath. Then a pulse. The ground trembled beneath her feet, slow at first like a drumbeat deep underground, then stronger. A crack spread through the soil before her, splitting the mouth of the hollow wider. Mist surged upward, spinning in a violent spiral. The air grew heavy with the scent of copper and old wood. Elsie stood firm. The hollow exhaled. And from its depths a voice surged, not spoken, not heard, but felt. It reached through bone, through memory. A voice made of centuries, of all the names whispered into the dark. You bring no name. Her voice was steady. I bring something else. You break the pattern. I reveal the lie. The fog thickened, rising like a wall, and from within it, shapes emerged, hundreds of them. Children. Ghosts of those lost, all staring with hollow eyes, their mouths stitched, their hands still. Elsie didn't flinch. They deserved more than silence, she said. The fog surged, and the voice grew louder. You were chosen. You were promised. You were given. I was never yours, she snapped. A gust slammed into her, knocking her to her knees. The soil burned beneath her palms. The hollow screamed, a sound like splintered wood and thunder. But through it another sound came, softer, familiar. A voice. Thomas. Elsie, it whispered. Don't give in. She rose slowly, breath ragged. I won't. From the shadows, the preacher from the grove stepped forward. His robes now tattered, his skin pale and stretched thin like bark. You should have written your name, he said. I still might, she replied, but not to obey, to end it. He reached for her. No name, no offering, and without the offering, she cut him off. The hollow starves. A low moan rumbled from the depths. Then let it starve. The preacher's face twisted. You'll doom us all. No, Elsie said. So you already did. She pulled the knife from her belt, the one that bore Thomas's initials, and carved a line into the ground at her feet. A single symbol from the journal, the circle with roots. The fog recoiled. The voice boomed. You cannot unmake what was sealed in blood. Then take mine, she said, but it comes with truth. And with that, she stepped into the hollow. The air turned thick and black, swallowing her whole. Down she went, not falling but descending, as if gravity bent inward. The world narrowed, sound distorted, every breath felt stolen. Then came silence, and the voice again. Why do you defy us? Because they never did. The dark shifted, shapes formed, images, Fragments. The original elders. The first child, barefoot in snow. A mother crying. A preacher praying, the ledger being opened, the pen, the signature, 100 faces behind them, 1,000. None spoke. Elsie shouted, "Who among you would have stopped it?" None stepped forward. She turned slowly. "Then I will." She walked toward the center of the dark, where a single root pulsed like a heart, thick, pale, alive. She reached into her coat, pulled the page Thomas had given her. It must take what it was promised, or be fed something else. She pressed it against the root. The entire hollow screamed. The darkness fractured. The root split, and light poured through the crack. Children's voices rose, not screams, but songs. Soft, broken lullabies. Names once whispered returned, each one louder than the last. Then came Thomas's, and she felt him beside her, hand in hand. The hollow shuddered again, and everything broke. Light split the dark like a blade. Elsie gasped as the shadows peeled back, revealing not the woods, not the hollow, but a corridor of memories. Each wall pulsed with images, flickering like candlelight, and at the center, a voice returned, quieter now, almost human. One must be freed. She took a step forward. The floor beneath her shifted, no longer soil or stone, but threads of moments, woven together in a tapestry of grief. Each strand shimmered, each one a child lost. She passed a doorway and saw Jonah Clark, age 6, painting beside a fire. His mother sang behind him, then gone. A flicker. The image twisted into cold, silence, mist. His name scratched onto a wall. She moved to the next. Abigail Merton dancing in the rain, spinning with wild laughter. Her brother clapped proud. Then march. A field empty, a doll left behind, one after another. Matthew, Lydia, Ruth. Each life, each moment. Taken. Each soul bound by the same pattern. Joy, silence, vanishing. The voice returned. "Can you see what they were?" "I do," Elsie whispered. "They linger, because no one chose them." She paused. "What do you mean?" "Only one can leave. One soul returned. All others remain. Such is the pact." Her chest tightened. "You must choose." Ahead, a circle of light appeared. 8 children stood inside it, the ones who had come before her. None spoke, none moved. And then a 9th figure stepped forward. Thomas. He looked just as she remembered. Same coat, same soft gaze, but something else lingered in his eyes now. Wait, understanding. "You can free one of us," he said gently. "Only one." She looked at him, stunned. "You knew?" He nodded. "I've always known, since the first night in the hollow." "Why didn't you say anything?" "I couldn't." "Not until you reached the root. Not until you saw." Elsie turned to the other children. Some stared blankly. Others smiled faintly. One little girl, barefoot and pale, held a wooden duck. "I can't choose," Elsie whispered. "It's not fair." Thomas stepped closer. "That's the cost, it always was." She dropped to her knees, covering her face. "I'm not strong enough." "You are. But if I take you, the others stay." "And if you don't," he said softly, "then we all stay." The words struck her like ice. "I didn't ask for this," she cried. "No one ever did." She looked up again, searching their faces. Every child had once been someone, had once dreamed of growing up, of birthdays, of the warmth of home. Now they stood like ghosts at the edge of forgetting. Her hands trembled, her heart pounded. She stood. "Then I choose—" She froze. One of the children, the smallest, the girl with the duck, stepped forward. She placed the toy at Elsie's feet and smiled. Elsie knelt. "What's your name?" The girl touched her lips, then shook her head. She stepped back into the circle. Thomas whispered, "That was Clara, Widow Mather's daughter." Elsie's throat closed. She thought of the old woman, blind, broken, still speaking her child's name in prayer. I choose Clara, she said. Thomas blinked, surprised. She was first, Elsie added. She should be the first to leave. The room trembled. A golden thread lifted from Clara's chest, rising slowly toward the sky above. The girl smiled once, tearfully, then faded like mist kissed by sun. The other children watched in silence. Thomas stepped forward again. You could have saved me. She smiled sadly. You already saved me. He nodded, understanding. Then end it. The voice returned, gentler now. One given, one returned. And the corridor began to dissolve. Elsie stood in the dark again, alone now. But for the first time it didn't feel empty. She had made her choice, and soon the hollow would face its own. Silence returned. Elsie stood alone, surrounded by dark and wind. The circle of children had vanished. The corridors of memory had collapsed into shadow. Only the root remained, split, pulsing, slick with something deeper than blood. The voice returned, faint now. One soul taken. One released. She breathed hard. It's not enough. It is the way. No, she said louder. Not anymore. The root twisted. A groan echoed through the hollow, low and drawn like a breath held too long. The mist recoiled, the soil cracked. The trees bent inward, whispering in a tongue older than sound. The debt was made in blood, the pact stands. Elsie stepped forward. Then take me. The hollow paused. You offer? She nodded. Willingly. If it ends with me. A pulse trembled through the earth. Willing is binding. The mist surged around her. Cold wrapped her limbs, roots uncoiled and reached. Her breath grew short. Her body felt distant, but her voice held. You'll take no one else. Not after me. One always follows. Not if I don't leave. The hollow hesitated. Then the roots rose. Dozens of them, wrapping her arms, her legs, her chest, lifting her gently, pulling her toward the mouth of the earth. Elsie didn't scream. She looked up at the trees, at the sliver of sky above, and whispered, Thomas, I'm sorry. And just before the dark closed fully, a hand grabbed hers. Firm, warm, familiar. Thomas. He wasn't a memory now. He was real. He pulled with everything he had, his grip stronger than it had ever been. The roots shrieked. The hollow buckled. The sky roared as the pact was broken, not through tradition or fear, but through defiance, through love. The charm around her neck burned hot, bone, thread, bloodroot, all snapping at once. And suddenly the light returned. The hollow screamed. Mist exploded upward in a geyser. The ground convulsed, tearing the air with sound. The trees split open, roots flailed, stones shattered. Thomas wrapped his arms around her as they collapsed onto the soil. Above them, the mouth of the hollow twisted in agony, unable to consume, unable to fulfill its bargain. The wound in the earth began to close, trembling violently. The preacher appeared one last time, his face cracked, his robes aflame. You damned us all! Elsie stared him down. No, we just remembered who we were. He reached for her and crumbled to ash. The hollow moaned once more, a long, dying breath, then fell silent, completely. The fog lifted. The mist died. And for the first time in living memory, the trees stood still. Elsie lay beside her brother, gasping, blinking at the stars now visible through the branches. You came back, she whispered. His voice was quiet. You pulled me. She smiled faintly. No. Clara did. He looked up at the sky. Then maybe they all did. They lay there until dawn began to rise, until the first rays of gold lit the tree line, and the hollow became just another dip in the forest, no longer breathing, no longer watching. Elsie sat up, the bloodroot charm nothing but ash against her chest. Thomas offered his hand. Come on. Let's go home. She hesitated, looking once more at the place that had once devoured the forgotten. Then she nodded. They walked back through the woods together, side by side, no fear at their heels. Behind them, the earth was still. But the silence no longer had teeth. Sunrise washed the world in gold as Elsie and Thomas left the forest behind. The air felt lighter, the heaviness that had pressed on every stone and shadow now gone. For the first time in years, birdsong returned to Gallow's Hollow, tentative at first, then joyful, echoing through the branches, as if celebrating the end of a long silence. They walked in step, each breath bringing a little more color back into the world. As they reached the edge of town, the fog that had haunted every doorstep was receding, drawn back by the new warmth in the air. Windows cracked open. People peered out, uncertain, faces pale with wonder and fear. Elsie's father waited at the garden gate, grey and tired but eyes clear for the first time in ages. He stared at Thomas as if seeing a ghost, then ran to embrace them both. Words failed, but the embrace spoke everything. The old bell in the chapel rang out, not a toll of mourning, but a bright, clean note that scattered the remaining mist. People gathered in the street, drawn by the sound, by the change in the light, by the way the ground no longer trembled beneath their feet. They stared at Elsie and Thomas, confusion giving way to hope, then awe, then tears. Widow Mathers came forward, leaning on her cane, eyes brimming with questions. Elsie met her gaze and shook her head softly. "She's free," Elsie whispered. "Clara's free." The old woman's hands trembled. She wept, not from grief, but from relief, and pressed a kiss to Elsie's forehead. "Thank you, child," she breathed. "Thank you for remembering." The townsfolk gathered around, voices rising in 100 questions. Elsie and Thomas spoke only a few words, enough to say what mattered. The pact was broken, the hollow was closed, and no child would ever be given again. Some wept openly. Others fell to their knees in thanks. The Reverend stood apart, head bowed, lips moving in silent prayer, humbled before a truth he could never again deny. The days that followed brought change in ways the town had never known. For the first time, the river sparkled blue instead of running grey. Wildflowers bloomed where the fog once gathered thick. Children played near the woods, laughing without fear, their parents watching close but smiling, not haunted. Elsie helped her mother down to the porch, where the old woman sat in sunlight, humming lullabies that no longer broke on a sob. Thomas tended the graves he'd once dreamed of escaping, carving names new and old with steady hands, making sure no one would ever again be forgotten. Spring settled into Gallow's Hollow, gentle and kind, and the story of the hollow itself began to fade, not erased, but retold differently, not as a threat whispered to keep children in line, but as a warning about bargains, about silence, about the cost of forgetting those we love. Elsie grew stronger with each day. The scars left by the hollow, inside and out, became a part of her, but not the only part. She would remember the voice in the woods, the cold touch of roots, the friends she could not save, and the brother she almost lost. But above all, she remembered what it meant to stand and say, "No more." At dusk she walked the woods with Thomas. The yew tree still stood, but its shadow no longer reached beyond its roots. The hollow, now filled with wild violets and sunlight, was just a place in the earth. Elsie placed a stone at its center, not as a marker of fear, but as a promise. Never again. Gallow's Hollow could finally breathe, and somewhere deep beneath the roots, even the old ghosts rested. Spring lingered long in Gallow's Hollow that year. For the first time, children dared to play in the meadows until dusk, their laughter rising in waves over fields bright with clover and golden light. The townsfolk began to smile more easily. Stories around the hearth shifted, not tales of things best left unspoken, but of resilience, of how darkness yields to those who remember, to those who refuse to let fear decide their fate. Elsie awoke each morning with sunlight on her pillow and the soft sound of Thomas tending the garden below. They spoke often now, words coming easily where once there had only been longing and silence. Sometimes they sat together on the porch, watching the road that twisted past the old yew tree, neither of them looking away anymore. The hollow itself became a place of gentle wonder. Wildflowers covered its floor, purple and blue and white, growing thick where nothing but roots had lived for centuries. The stone Elsie had set at its center remained, gathering offerings of feathers, beads, and ribbons from grateful hands, not out of fear, but remembrance. Sometimes, when the wind was soft, it seemed to carry music, and those who listened swore they could hear the laughter of all the children who had been lost echoing with joy, free at last. Elsie took time with Widow Mathers, who lingered in the newfound warmth, her eyes brighter though still clouded. They shared stories of Clara and of all the things they would not forget, sitting together long into the evenings, grateful for the peace that finally settled on the town. Gallow's Hollow changed, but it did not forget. The story of the pact, the ledger, the price once paid, was passed down as truth, not as a fable but as a warning and a lesson. The church bells still rang, but no longer as a threat. Instead, they called people together in joy, in hope, in gratitude for each day that began without loss. Years went by. The village grew, and new children were born. The woods remained deep. The fog sometimes returned, but always thinner, gentler, never again heavy with dread. The old rituals faded, replaced by new traditions. A festival each spring, a walk to the hollow with lanterns and song, names spoken aloud, no one ever forgotten. Elsie, now older, often found herself standing at the edge of the woods, remembering the night she had chosen to face the darkness. The scars on her hands reminded her of the cost, but the peace in her heart made her grateful she had dared to pay it. She missed the friends she had not been able to save, but their voices were no longer lost, or they were part of every joyful morning, every bell rung, every story told in the golden light. And as dusk fell on another leap year, she sat with Thomas by the fireside, listening as the younger children recited the tale of the hollow. They didn't flinch at the scary parts. They understood what it meant to refuse the silence. Elsie smiled, knowing the story would outlive her, and that no child in Gallow's Hollow would ever be given to the dark again. If this story moved you, if you want to follow more tales of courage, loss, and the power of remembrance, make sure to subscribe now. Your support keeps stories like these alive, and you won't want to miss the next journey into the shadows and beyond. And if you're ready for another unforgettable tale, click the video suggested on your screen right now. There's always another secret, another mystery waiting for those brave enough to listen. Thank you for joining us in Gallow's Hollow. Remember, the light is strongest where the shadows once were.